the Havalon Piranta. Done a couple of videos on it already. Wanted to talk a little bit about using it in the kitchen, food preparation, a couple of other issues, some amusing facts. On the positive, very narrow blade, very thin blade, low edge angle, very high initial sharpness, both on the push and on the slice, means it makes an excellent paring knife for peeling and other fine cutting. The only drawback is essentially you have this much blade, because here's the blade holder, so if you try to cut anything that long, you'll sort of smack into the blade holder. But for finer paring, very, very nice. Moving on to dicing, mincing, that type of work. Again, if you're making cuts with this distance or less, works perfect. On anything longer than this, which generally comes on anything of significant size, even small potatoes, you're doing multiple cuts. You can do it, but it's relatively awkward because you essentially slice through the potato, open it up a bit, slice through it again. It was kind of an amusing moment for me when I was thinking about using this for the dicing of the potatoes versus using a heavier blade tactical folder, because the heavier blade tactical folder of course doesn't have the little blade stop here, so we can cut through them in one cut. It doesn't have the repeated slices, but you are using more force and less control. I'll talk a little bit about that later. Using it on meats, I even carved up a roast for Sunday dinner, did a bunch of other work. Again, really high initial sharpness, very thin blade, and a relatively low edge angle, sails through meats. And with meats you don't have the issue of the blade guard, of course, because meats are not really rigid, so this slips in there no problem. The only thing is for making large slices off a ham and such like that, you're doing multiple cuts because again your blade length is rather short compared to, of course, a carving knife. But it does cut with extremely high control, very tiny amounts of force, and it is kind of amusing when you're up to someone else's, at a friend or family members, and you see him struggling trying to cut through something, because not everybody keeps their knives really sharp, and you just sort of pop this out and start slicing up the roast effortlessly. It's kind of amusing. I also worked on some chickens, a couple of rabbits, and even a turkey. Again, works relatively well. On the chickens and the turkey, this is where it gets a bit interesting. It doesn't have the kind of rigidity that you would want for bone cutting. Even for the wingtips, I tried to do some press cutting through the wingtips, and the blade just moves around, and you get the feeling very quickly that you're going to snap the blade off by trying to press it through the wingtips. But it's relatively easy to use. Say if you want to separate a leg from a thigh, you basically make the cut in the fat line where the joint is, pop it open, use the point to cut on top, cut on bottom, the joint separates completely, and then you make your complete cut. That's about 4 cuts. Now with a heavier kitchen knife, of course, you generally use the heel, put it on it, make one heavy push or maybe a palm heel strike, and you're through. And with the Piranta, again, you're doing those 4 cuts. The first small chicken that I did, I was about twice as long if I was using this compared to, again, standard chef's knife. But I was sort of figuring out how to cut it with this. A lot of the fat trimming and actually cutting around the meats, again, very, very fast. But separating the joints around the bones, again, you're cutting away from the bones rather than doing push right towards it. The other thing with this is you have an intricate or exquisite amount of feedback. That's because the edge and blade and angle are so small that it cuts into even the ends of the bones trivially. So most kitchen knives have a much thicker bevel with a much wider angle, so they'll tend to slip around the edges of the bones. The Piranta cuts into them relatively easy, so you know exactly where the edge is if you just try to cut straight and true. So much more tactile feedback. And the second chicken that I did, and then when I finally went to the turkey, I was becoming much faster because I knew where I had to cut, and I wasn't thinking about, okay, how do I separate this leg and this thigh anymore? How do I take the actual whole leg right off the chicken or the turkey. I got the method figured out, so it's just cut, work away, pop, pop, and it comes off. The really interesting thing, though, is that when I switched back to using a knife like this is a really nice custom from Phil Wilson. It's his South Fork model. Now, normally you wouldn't call this a really heavy, rugged, durable knife, obviously. But if you compare the blade to the Piranta, all of a sudden when you're using this, the stiffness and the durability in comparison are sort of magnified. The other thing, which I found really interesting, was I became much faster with the South Fork after using the Piranta. And what I realized, of course, was because I was learning to become so particular with the Piranta and cutting around the joints, when I switched to the South Fork, I was getting much more experience, so I could just make that one smooth cut much closer around where the joints were. So again, you're picking up precision and skill from the Piranta, and it transfers over to the South Fork. When you can use more force, I often found I didn't need to, again, because of the skill and experience of using this for around 2 weeks on chickens, turkeys, rabbits, that type of deal, and even working around ribs. And like I said, I was carving up roasts and doing some silly things with it. Then I went out and revisited some of the utility work and brush work that I normally do with heavier knives, and I found the same thing. Because I had been spending time with the Piranta and figuring out how to do the cutting with very little force, when I had a heavier knife, I really wasn't leaning into it as much as I had done in the past, because you're picking up these small tips and techniques and learning how to move and maneuver the knife to remove that lateral loading and focus again on an up and down sort of straight cut, and it was relatively interesting. As a side effect of that, even though I normally run my edges relatively thin and relatively acute, I found that I've been able to shave them down even a little bit more, because again, I'm picking up how to work with a much thinner blade and keep this intact. And of course, so if you can use this blade and not break it, and again, this is the slightest of the Havalon blades. This is the number 60. There's one very similar to this, which is 20% thicker. There's another one which is much larger, which is 50% thicker. And you remember, of course, that stiffness is cubic with thickness, and strength is quadratic with thickness. So if you make a blade 20% thicker, it's not 20% stronger, it's 20% squared stronger, and it's 20% cubed stiffer, which is huge. And 50% squared and 50% cubed is massive. So even though they may not sound like significant changes, they are. So works very well in the kitchen as a small paring knife for doing any kind of precise work where you want about that much blade. It works very well around meats. Again, take care that you can't smash through joints. You do have to cut around them. And working with this exclusively and focusing all the work I had to do with this has allowed me to refine my skill and pick up some experience, which transfers over when I go to a more durable blade. I'm finding I don't need to lean into it as much, and I'm able to refine the edge angles and the edge thickness on these durable blades, which makes them cut a little bit better. Now, an interesting thing, which is kind of amusing, was I have been sharpening this blade. And if you watch the sales on Havalon's website, and depending on which blades you buy and how big of a pack you buy, these blades can get to be as low as 15 cents a blade. And I was using this to basically keep the blade sharp. This is a Waterstone. It's not a Japanese Waterstone, unfortunately, so we are limited. So this is an 8,000 side and a 3,000 grit side, and this is about $100. There's many different types of stones you can get. The funny thing was, I was thinking as I was sharpening this, it's actually costing me more in terms of loss of abrasive than it would be if I just changed a blade. That's kind of funny, because I can buy about 600 to 1,000 of these blades for the cost of this stone, and it's relatively amusing. I don't think I'd be able to sharpen it 1,000 times, because I like to lap the stones to keep them relatively flat, so there's only about a centimeter of stone. Of course, that's when you get into the argument that Murray Carter has: you don't lap stones all the time because you waste too much of it. Instead, you should work little bits of the stone to keep it all nice and even. And yeah, you could do that. The downside is, of course, I like to keep the stones very, very flat, because that minimizes my time on the stone and I get much more consistent results. But I thought that was relatively amusing. If you just do a quick calculation, you can find out it could be even more in terms of money that you're spending if you're using a stone like this to actually sharpen a knife rather than just replace the blades. I do think I will continue sharpening because I find it's sort of a hobby. You know, I was watching Game of Thrones, and great show. So I was sharpening up a couple of knives, and it's something that I enjoy doing anyway. It's a skill that I sort of want to develop and refine, but I did think it was kind of amusing, again, because the cost of these blades gets so absolutely low, they sort of actually approach the cost of abrasives, even if you don't factor in your time. So, general update: works very well as a utility knife, even though they don't promote it and they're very clear not to use it as such. You can, if you focus on your skill and technique and focus on straight up and down cuts and not twisting or prying. Works very well in the kitchen as a small paring knife, a utility knife for shortcuts, and of course works very well on meats. I think I'm going to continue carrying this now for an extended period of time. And what I'm going to start looking at now is just how far do I have to go before snapping the blades becomes a problem. Like, can I break down a chicken in a certain period of time and keep the blade intact? Can I break down a larger duck or a turkey in a certain period of time and keep the blade intact? If I have to work on a brace of rabbits and I want to get them done right away because you're outside, it's in the rain, and you're trying to get them cleaned up, can I keep a blade intact? I'll also be talking to some friends who are going moose hunting later on in the year, and I think I'll tag along with them, use it on some larger animals. Really looking forward to it. And again, I will be carrying it as a personal utility knife, and just looking at it again from that aspect, and start doing it for harder and harder and harder cutting, and see, and just continue no matter how silly it gets. Like, if I had to do some roofing work and cutting up some asphalt and fiberglass shingles, can I do it? That's really absurd to even try to attempt with a knife like this, which again is a disposable scalpel, but that's part of the enjoyment of experimentation, is finding out where all these lines actually lie and not just going by some assumptions. So very enjoyable little blade to work with, proving itself much more useful. And the ironic thing about this is I never really bought this with a serious intent to use it as an everyday carry kitchen meatwork type knife. I bought it because it was kind of amusing for me, for people to pick up a knife like a Sebenza Spyderco Military Benchmade 710 Access, and when people would use that to do anything beyond the extreme light cutting, they would get claims of, oh well, that's abusive if something happened to the knife. Like, they take a Sebenza and try to pop a piece of a tree off a small branch, and the blade blows apart, or the handle slab comes off, or the lock disengages, and people say, oh, that's abusive. So of course, if you're calling all that abusive and all you're left with to do with your knife is really light cutting, well then you end up with, this is what you should be carrying, because this is what this is made to do. It has an extremely thin blade, it has a very low edge angle, and it comes with a very high sharpness. These are the things you would look for if you were just doing precise cutting. The only reason you would get a thicker blade is to allow it to do that sort of twisting, chopping, and hacking type cutting. So I bought it originally as a point to explore that concept, but it's turned into a far more useful knife than I actually thought, which is kind of interesting.